Good evening and a very warm welcome to this event on creating a media commons, part of the Media Reform Coalition's Media Democracy Festival 2022. I'm Debs Grayson, I work for MRC, and a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. Please do check out the rest of the sessions on mediareform.org.uk. The entire festival is free, but if you would like to donate towards the running costs, a donation button is on the website homepage. We will be having contributions from our speakers, and then we will be having a discussion, including your questions. So please do write them in the chat on whatever platform you're on, and make them clear and brief so that we can have as many as possible. And do interact with the festival on socials using the hashtag MDF22 and tag @MediaReformUK. And finally, thanks to World Citizens London for promoting our ticket link to your members. Okay, so as I said, I'm Debs Grayson and I work for the Media Reform Coalition on the BBC and Beyond campaign, and this event is part of that campaign. The campaign began last year, and we spent the first half of 2021 talking to loads of people, individuals, organisations, and running public events which engaged 30,000 people, all of which fed into our manifesto for a people's media. This outlines a vision for a media system fit to face the challenges of the future. When we first started the campaign, we were talking about this as about reimagining public media. But over the course of writing the manifesto, we shifted our language to talking about the media commons. This was in response to things that we heard from a great number of people about the need to really not think in narrow terms about just media reform, but think deeply about the connections between the transformations that we need to see in our media and the transformations that we need to see more broadly in society in order to face the huge challenges of this century, not least climate breakdown, as we're seeing with the terrifying temperatures in the Arctic and Antarctic this week. And we think that this language of the commons helps to make these connections. Probably the most intuitive kind of commons that you would think of is a land commons, a place. And you might also have heard talk about digital commons or data commons. So the idea of a media commons kind of intrinsically makes those connections. So a commons, broadly speaking, is a collective resource which is managed and sustained by the people who rely on it through their kind of active participation. A commons is defined by shared values and practices for living out those values. For a media commons, we suggest in the manifesto that those core values should be being independent, being accountable, being democratic, and being for everyone. And practices for living these out could look like a lot of things. So, practices for being democratic could be quite formal mechanisms like you have in media cooperatives, where members can vote to be on the board and then make decisions about, what the media organisation is going to do. But they can also be more informal kind of cultural practices. For example, the way that lots of community radio stations are set up with, tatty old sofas and a really welcoming atmosphere, where there's always someone who's available to, chat and to listen. And those make them, the best community radio stations are some of the most inclusive spaces that we have in our media system today. So the vision that we outline for a media commons would contain a transformed People's BBC and a People's Channel 4, so where our national broadcasters have been democratised and devolved and become far more embedded and connected to communities. We have events on Friday looking in more detail at what a People's Channel 4 and a People's BBC could look like. And alongside these, we talk about the independent media commons, so a thriving ecology of community radio stations, people's newsrooms, cultural producers, digital innovators. And we say that these need to be supported to exist in all communities through new sources of public funding, amongst other kinds of funding, which would be democratically controlled so that you are ensuring that this doesn't cause the same kinds of problems of independence, lack of independence that we're seeing with the public funding of the BBC currently. So a media commons is a relatively new idea. And there are lots of things to be figured out about it. There are definitely some tensions in it. Lots of talk about the Commons sees it as a space of resistance to the state, and yet we're saying that a media commons would contain a transformed BBC and new forms of public funding. So how would that work? And I think more broadly, there's this real challenge of trying to be visionary and make something feel like a real possibility when it's so far from the kind of media system that we have today. Fortunately, we've got a great panel of speakers today to explore some of these ideas. It's a slightly different lineup to what was advertised, but we will be hearing from Lexie Kirkconnell-Kawana, who is Head of Regulation at the Independent Press Regulator in Press. Then we'll hear from Shirish Kulkarni, community organiser with the People's Newsroom, which is part of Bureau Local. And then we will hear from Clive Lewis, who is MP for Norwich South and a former journalist, who will be joining us slightly late at 7:15, but perfectly in time to give his response. So yes, we'll start with kind of 10-minute contributions from each of you, and then we'll go to discussion. So Lexie, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, thanks very much, Debs, for that introduction. So when we were approached and asked about speaking on this panel and talking about what the features of this common might be, where my mind went to automatically was thinking about, setting up the architecture, setting up the governance of the commons, and setting out rule sets that would apply therein. And this is naturally because I'm a lawyer by trade. I believe in the law, I believe in rule sets, I believe in governing norms, and importantly, level playing fields. I think so long as we're operating within a shared set of goals, values, and limitations, and we can all participate in a safe, respectful, creative, and fulfilling way, then we should also be able to hold each other to account for when there's been a breach of those boundaries, and particularly when those breaches tantamount to threatening the safety of both ourselves as individuals or others we care about, or the community at large. And my reflection on creating a new media commons for addressing this is because the new space that we currently have is one which has largely evaded effective rule sets. And that's not because citizens don't want rules. When every time we poll the public and collectively, we always find that sort of over 70% of respondents always want better regulation of the media or better systems of redress in place for seeking better outcomes when there's been harm or abuse. And the reason we don't have effective rule sets in the UK is because there are really powerful vested interests interested in maintaining that. They want to monopolise news and information because, like all commodities that are necessary public goods, you've always got that captive market that you can exploit and control. And having no limitations on your capacity to commercialise and profit from that market, even if it leads to abuse, is the object of those powerful interests. So the status quo is as it is, where we have a fairly unregulated news market. And I use that term exploit and abuse literally, because what we know about the product of unregulated news markets or information markets is that there's always abuse, there's always discrimination, there's always falsehoods which threaten our sense of reality and undo our social fabric. And the social democratic harm of that is very real. We've had plenty of examples of the last couple of years, previous to that of the types of harms that come about because of unfettered information. And so we know that both there is harm that needs addressing and that the public want it. So if we're going to go about and create a set of rules, one that evades capture by powerful interests, but also rests that power and the authority of the public, we'll have to determine, well, who's going to make those rules? And when we talk about public, I think there's a natural inclination towards a role for government or parliament to play. Parliament is a representative body of the people endowed with rulemaking authority, so surely they have a role to play. And naturally, we are called to resist that because there's many reasons. We may not want the government to be determining the rules that govern news and information. Again, loads of historical examples of political interference in speech to demonstrate that. So who else if not the government? Well, what about the practitioners? The body of practitioners, journalists that make up the space, the industry, quote unquote. Why not have them determine what that rule set is? And again, what we know historically, there have been 7 government inquiries into industry malpractice of the press since the 1950s. And every time reform is proposed, it is undermined and then waylaid by, again, these powerful interests at play. I mean, for example, the Press Complaints Commission, which has since been disestablished in the 2010s, was quoted as being a cheerleader for the press during the Leveson inquiry. So clearly not well placed to determine the rule sets or enforce those rules. And so by and large, the industry unfortunately just doesn't have a good track record of determining the rule set or abiding by it by itself. So we have this inadequate settlement where we don't have a very good rule set for determining or addressing malpractice and abuse in the information space, and there are no conditions to incentivize the existing industry to do better. So we have the settlement where about 70% of the news market sit outside any form of effective regulation. And the political trends are towards entrenching that and entrenching the existing power structures and interests in determining, what rules go. So if not the government, if not the industry or practitioners as the only stakeholders in determining the rules, what other segments of society could participate in determining these rule sets? And my natural inclination is towards, well, what about the public? What about civil society as representative bodies of the public? And for Impress, that's where we've got to. Impress was founded out of civil society. And in the 5 years since our founding, we've developed a code, we've developed a rule set in consultation with the public. We've since had over 200 news titles join Impress, and they are contractually obliged to follow that rule set, and we've got more joining every month. And importantly, what we do is we deliver a range of services to the public for free that engage that rule set. And we have the structures in place that prevent political or industry capture. And we've made those very clear over the years. But importantly, I think as well, one feature of our organisation is we're very agile. So we can adapt our rules in our code and our services in response to public need. So we don't need a law pushed through Parliament, for example, to amend our constitutive parts. We can be much more responsive to the issues of the day. And so we work with both the public and industry and civil society to determine that rule set for the members that join us, so that any person who knows they're going on to an Impress regulated website knows what the standards are that the editorial team follows, and they may even have helped create those standards. And they'll also know, and this is again one of the bottom lines of the regulation model that we follow, is that the public needs to know, that reader needs to know what support is available to them if they want to raise an issue or seek redress. And I think that's such an important part of entering a space when we talk about, what are the values that we want to bring to a new media commons. It's when you enter a space, when you enter a sphere, when you come into a place, you want to know, is it safe for me here? Can I trust it? What happens if something goes wrong? And what we have now for Impress, I kind of call it as like a gated community, because outside of what we do, outside of some limits on broadcasting to a certain extent, that's not the universality of experience. You know, a user moving through the online space, through their news space, don't have that certainty that they are moving it through safe, secure, and accountable media spaces. And then there isn't really a collective consciousness about what people should expect from news. And I think there's a big public education piece, a consultative piece to address that. The Reuters Institute Trust in News project brings that to life, that people aren't really aware about what they should expect from the quality of news. They sort of have affiliations to brands, but they don't really understand what journalists do or why they do it. And that's a piece of work that we're certainly hoping to spearhead in the future. So I think consultation in particular as one method of collective agreement on the issues of rule sets and accountability is really important. And you can think about that in loads of different ways, about how we determine what the public interest is, what practitioners, journalists' duties are, and then on our own behalf, what sort of services we need to provide to have effective redress. And on that redress point, I just want to really hammer home the fact that a lot of people say, well, journalists are subject to the law, so they have to follow the law, and surely that's the end of it. You know, why should we need extra rules for a media commons or a media space? And what I say to that is, well, at the beginning of the year, for example, the media list, the media courts list set out that there are only going to be 12 cases scheduled for the year, and that's down from the year before. So what that indicates, I mean, it simply just doesn't reflect the reality of industry malpractice, and that malpractice could be malicious or it could just be accidental. But the fact that there's only 12 cases going through the courts this year, I think is a real indictment of how the law works with journalism. And why there are only 12? Well, we're in a situation where there is a right to justice, but there is no means to access justice if you're trying to seek justice in the media space. So it's a real competition of arms. Ordinary citizens, you know, often fail because they don't have the resources to take people to court over issues or breaches of media law. And in the inverse, small publishers suffer and fail as well because wealthy litigants can pull huge resources to sink stories. And what I always say, as much as I'm, an advocate for the law, if laws aren't being enforced, and I think 12 cases probably demonstrates they aren't, there's an implication that the law doesn't apply, and that resonates across spaces. If enforcement isn't happening, if laws aren't being applied through our traditional justice system, what sort of redress or options should be available in our new media commons? And again, at Impress, and why we deliver the services free to the public we are is because we see that gap. One of the things we offer, for example, is it's free if a member of the public want to bring a claim against a publisher for them to access a well-qualified independent arbitrator to resolve their dispute. And all Impress publishers have to participate. It's compulsory. But on that compulsory note, what's really unique, idiosyncratic about arbitration as an alternative way to access justice is the parties can actually agree the terms of the dispute with the arbitrator. And what they get in the result is an enforceable contract that has standing in law. And it's a really interesting way and an interesting tool to get fair and equitable outcomes that actually reflect the interests of both parties involved. And what we're trying to do is expand out this service to the media market, but I would say it's a direct response to a failing system, and we're rising to that challenge. But just as a final point, I think it's just so necessary for us to come up with alternative solutions in our new media spaces for determining these rule sets, for determining how they should be enforced. Importantly, so that those participating in the space can feel like they can trust it, that it's safe, and that there is accountability. And that's part of the systemic mission of Impress, and part of what we would like to see in a new media commons.
Thanks so much, Lexie. And yeah, I've been so interested in the conversations that we've had about, the relationships between these ideas of a commons and this kind of more consensual way of managing things together, and, ideas of abolition, and how do we move beyond ideas that the only way that we can solve problems is through a kind of top-down process of criminalization, which is not only itself incredibly violent, but as you're saying, is also it's really ineffective. It does not actually solve the problems that we face. Okay, great. Shirish, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you. And it's always love hearing Lexie talk about this, because she gives such kind of clear framework for the things which I kind of feel instinctively, and it helps me understand why I think the things I do. And I'm really struck always by when she talks about safety, and it's about making media, about making journalism a safe space for me, for all of us. So people often ask me when I talk at events like this, Shirish, how can we save the journalism industry? And the truth is, I don't want to save the journalism industry as it currently exists, because too many of its people, too many of its methods, and too much of its output are destructive and run completely counter to what I believe the true purpose, aims, and values of journalism are, or at least should be. But in that question, sometimes without realizing it, the people that it's asking that are acknowledging a truth, I think, that journalism is a public good that deserves saving for all of us, that is absolutely crucial in defining the conversations which help shape society, and that therefore the commercial model we all see around us isn't the best way to deliver journalism. Because I don't care about journalism for journalism's sake. I don't care about it for my job. I care about it precisely because of its importance in shaping our discourse, and therefore shaping almost every interaction we have with each other, with society, and with the world at large. So after spending 25 years now working mainstream broadcasting, and in fact in all of the major UK broadcast newsrooms, I now spend most of my time either working on or advocating for a different kind of journalism, a different kind of journalist, and a different kind of media industry. And that's because those 25 years have taught me that journalism is broken. And even supposedly impartial journalism largely ends up serving a particular set of people and interests, as Lexie talked about, which actually represent a very tiny proportion of the population. So let's call that, for the sake of argument, white, cis, male, middle and upper class, metropolitan. You can see where I'm going with this. And like I say, when you don't understand, when those people don't cater for, when they essentially rule out of their world people of color, disabled people, women, frankly, members of the LGBTQ plus community, working class people, then actually the media is very often speaking to very, very few people. And then they then wonder, while audience figures or reader numbers are diminishing, it's frankly because there are more of us and fewer of them. Now, we know about the racism, transphobia, ableism, etc., in the media, and that includes, and frankly, sometimes led by, the public broadcaster. But the habits of journalism are even more subtle than that, I think. I'll give you an example. We've had the spending review today, and you'll hear language like this in the budget too. The terribly clever kind of interactive content you get from the broadcast and the papers is always framed in terms of, as a result of this budget, you'll be £100 a year better off. So frankly, that is not journalism. That's an ideological statement that says a low tax, small state economy is good for us per se. Like, it's just better. Because the way that discussion is framed by mainstream media doesn't allow for the fact that we may want more public money, our money, spent on health, education, who knows, even broadband. So better off is framed in such narrow terms, and that's not by accident. It's because it suits a particular group of people who already have privilege and don't need the kinds of public services, let's call them commons, that the rest of us, most of the population, need and rely on. And that particular group of people just happen to own the newspapers. Like I say, it's no accident. But as the world becomes ever more complex, what we need from journalism, but what we don't get really from the current system, is sense making. We need our journalism to make sense of the world and help us understand the choices we need to make as individuals, communities, and societies. And I do some work on sort of understanding what I think journalism should be for. And I came up with a construction I call orientation. And by that I mean journalism should help us understand the world, locate us in our environment, and enable us to meaningfully interact with it. And also journalism should help us form views which are consistent with the needs and interests of our families and our communities. Now, when I put it like that, it sounds obvious. But if we look at the journalism that actually exists in the world, almost none of it fulfills that purpose. And lots of that is because of the economic model in which it currently exists. So here, where I live in Wales, that idea of forming views which are consistent with the needs of ourselves, the interests of needs of ourselves, our families, and our communities, hit particularly hard after events like the Brexit vote. Because I've stood talking to people in Ebbw Vale's town centre, for example, a place where the migrant population is less than 1%, and you literally cannot move for bumping into signs telling you how much development there was supported by EU money. But yet people lined up to tell me how they never got anything from Europe and they're fed up of migrants coming over and taking their jobs and using public services. Now, I'd argue a lot of that is because Wales is the perfect example of some of the negative impacts of a media system that serves corporations rather than communities. Because firstly, clearly, those people in Ebbw Vale and all over the country are not responding to the situation in Wales. They're responding to a picture that's sold to them by vested interests in the London media. Secondly, because of centralisation, for example, of reach, Wales's national newspaper, I'm doing big inverted commas there, or at least the online version, is largely not made in Wales. Much of its content comes from a hub in Birmingham, or clickbait is harvested from reach outlets all over the UK, so that I am regularly served stories about coronavirus restrictions in England, not in Wales, which say they mean nothing to me and are actually the opposite often of what they are in England. So you may have seen this week about Reach imposing page view targets on its reporters. And NewsQuest, which has just agreed to buy Argent, potentially giving it more than 30% of the local news market, does very similar things. So that is self-evidently not a model which could ever lead to better journalism that provides that orientation role, that sense-making role for us. And even because of the kind of model which exists around them, even the independent media sector in Wales has related, although slightly different problems. Don't get me wrong, there are very good people doing very good things, lots of that voluntarily or for very little compensation. But they are, frankly, almost exclusively white, middle-aged men who may have been journalists in those mainstream media outlets before, but are now often doing pretty much the same thing, just independently. So there's not as much innovation or inclusion as I think we'd all like to see. And as a result, those products are always going to be unlikely to reach the audiences some people call hard to reach, but I call badly served. because it's not the audience's fault, it's the fault of the media organisation. So those are just some of the problems which I think the concept of a media commons could really help us address. We all know there's lots of work to do on ironing out wrinkles and working out what's possible and what's not. But I think we have an incredibly useful starting point from which we can build a better media. And the work I've done firstly at Bureau Local and most recently in the People's Newsroom Initiative at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism has shown that more participatory, more distributed, and more inclusive models can really work. So as an example, one of the most successful things that's ever been done at the Bureau was an investigation into pay at Deliveroo, which some of you may have seen or read about. Now, that wasn't an overnight success. It was an 8-month process which started with a series of sense-making and consultation events, which helped us understand key issues in precarious and insecure work. We then invited just simple 200-word pitches from people with experience in those areas. We wanted to understand and reflect the realities of insecure work. And then we worked with many of those people to help them tell stories in ways that made real impact. And the important thing to note is we never think of those distributed participatory approaches as kind of fluffy, nice to haves that make us feel good about ourselves. We think they're important because you end up getting better journalism as a result, because so many more people are involved in a collaborative experience. But you also get journalism which people trust, largely because people are involved in it. They're in a sense co-opted because they've made it. So people begin to trust it. They don't think it's just people in London telling us what to think. And the other really hopeful thing about that was that story was co-published with both the Mirror and ITV News. So you may have seen Roswyn Jones' series of articles on the story, or you may have seen it on News at 10 on ITV. And I think that's a real sign of hope, because a few enlightened people across the media are already seeing the value of collaboration, participation, and new ways of doing journalism and new models of working. So I think we've reached a real turning point in journalism where if we carry on with business as usual, we will quickly and perhaps rightly drive the industry into irrelevance. So there's a real opportunity here, but deep-rooted problems require radical solutions. And if we want to make that change before it's too late, then we need to really start exploring those solutions right now. Thank you.
That's brilliant, Shirish, and welcome to Clive. I'm glad you've been able to make it after the spring statement. And that was brilliant, Shirish, and it kind of addresses one of the questions that was actually posed to Lexie about saying, are rules enough to build trust, and recognising that trust in the media is low. And I guess what you're saying, Shirish, is that actually it's through participation that actually that there is the possibility of not even necessarily rebuilding, it's actually building trust in the first place. So I'm going to bring you on in a second, Clive, but yeah, just to recap slightly, we're talking about the creation of a media commons, and we've heard from Lexie from Impress about forms of accountability and how we can have we can imagine, and in fact Impress are practicing a more kind of consensual way of setting rules and setting norms and holding each other to account, that is not just a kind of top-down model of kind of criminalization from the state, which in any case absolutely does not work. And then we've heard from Shirish about kind of new models of journalism and how they can kind of point the way forward for a better media system. So Clive, do you want to give us some words?
Some words. Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Is that okay? I haven't got to unmute or anything like that. Fantastic. Doing a goldfish. So yeah, thank you. Sorry I'm late, but obviously you can probably imagine it's quite hectic here today with the spring statement, which I will maybe kind of weave into what I'll say very quickly. But I think my understanding is that what I'm going to give to the kind of express to the meeting today is how a lot of what you're seeing in the media is mirrored elsewhere in politics and our economy. So the oversight and centralisation of media control in the UK, it is a mirror image of over-centralisation in our politics and economy. And I guess, where power lies matters, whether that's communicative power or political power or economic power. And the over-centralisation of that power in any sphere of our society or any institution leads to the over-representation of the interests of those who have the power. And so that means that you get over-representation of elite interests. It's in driving privatization, poor public service delivery, planetary destruction, racism, sexism. Their interests, what benefits them is what gets prioritized, what gets communicated. And so ultimately, I think that's why commoning, collective ownership, democratization, public ownership is a big part of the answer to righting the wrongs in our politics and our economy. And sometimes it's very easy to get down and depressed about the state of politics at the moment. Being in this place, that can happen. But actually, those ideas, many of them, I think, have won out after 50 years of kind of monopoly capitalism, neoliberalism, that over-centralization of the economy, of our politics, the hollowing out of our democracy, the hollowing out of our media. I think people instinctively understand this. And so a lot of the research that I know that me and Caroline Lucas did during lockdown, which was called Reset, where we spoke to tens of thousands of people during lockdown, you kind of get an understanding that people know that something isn't working and that something which has collective ideals at its heart, whether it's the economy, whether it's in how government works, whether it's how our media works. People are keen and open for change because they know this system isn't working. So, I mean, the Media Reform Coalition has put out so much fantastic information, which politicians and others use so often to explain just how dire the situation is in our media. We know that our media is dominated. I think 90% of the national newspaper market is now dominated by just 3 companies, I think it is. 83% of local newspapers controlled by just 6 companies. Facebook now dominates, controls the 3 of the top 5 social media services used to access online news in the UK. And that's reflected, that over-centralisation is reflected in our economic system. So we know we've seen a concentration of wealth, which is probably only going to increase after today's spring statement. We've had a chancellor who's just put through tax reforms and changed and tweaked tax thresholds, which the founder said is going to disproportionately benefit the wealthiest half of our society as a massive cost of living crisis heads our way in the coming weeks and months. It's already here. It's been here for the last 15 years, but it's going to enter into a new phase now. So we know the wealthiest 10% of households held 43% of all the wealth in this country, in comparison to the bottom 50% who held, I think, just under 10%. IPPR North have said that over-centralisation is the root cause of regional disparity, and it's getting worse. So since 2010, central government employment has risen by 23%, while local government employment has fallen by 31%. And at the same time, central government is keeping an increasing amount of tax revenue in its own pocket. I think something like 96 in every pound in tax was taken by Whitehall. So the spring statement today has done nothing to kind of undo that. We didn't expect that. That's where this government is. I think when you begin to understand that, and I think you guys will all understand that, the fact that our media reflects that, then you can begin to see that reflected in other parts of our polity. I worked at the BBC for many years, for more than a decade before I came into politics. I understand quite clearly how the BBC works, how it editorializes, how it operates in the interests of a specific outlook and certain views. I think we can all see that the BBC's current ownership model has been transformed by neoliberalism, just like many other public services. So they're not providing truly universal services that advance the public interest, over which there is a real, public control. If you look at, for example, the NHS privatisation, the health and care bill that's going through Parliament, again, it's a similar direction of travel. So on the face of it, the rollout of the integrated care system model might look like a devolution of power. That's how it's being sold to the public. But the reality is these reforms will transfer power from the NHS a publicly owned body, as limited as that is, to integrated care boards, which will have, private healthcare companies and the private sector disproportionately represented on there, making decisions about where money and how budgets are spent. And I think you can make a similar comparison to what's happened in primary and secondary education with academies, the academies model. Again, publicly funded, privately run, benefiting the interests of a few. You begin to see, an increasing number of exclusions. There is a class dimension to this, and I think many of you will probably be aware of that. So if you also take COVID, for example, we know that the People's Vaccine is a campaign that I was involved with. That campaign understood that you'll only overcome the pandemic if you tackle the issue of intellectual property and the monopoly that big pharma has on those intellectual property rights. Unless that was cracked, unless it was taken away, we knew that those vaccines wouldn't get to vast parts of the world, and that's been proven to be correct. And that's again another situation where the centralization, kind of monopoly capitalism, has smashed any sense of a kind of global medical priority for the people of the world, and that's something which has come through. Another area I'll kind of conclude on this is the Green New Deal. So myself and a number of about 10 MPs have put together what's called the Green New Deal, and it's kind of what you would call the political and economic decarbonisation gold standard. And at the heart of this piece of legislation, which is kind of, we've talked to trade unions, NGOs, activists, climate activists, and many others over the last 3 years since it was put down, 4 years, in fact, back in 2018, and it's expanded to kind of take into account the changing needs of the climate movement. But at the heart of that, we acknowledge that at the heart of this project, there is the need for political and economic democratization. And subsidiarity is a guiding principle of that bill, because we understand that key local political, social, and economic issues should be made by those closest to and the people affected by the things that come out of the climate crisis. So I think the other part of that is the democratization process that's desperately needed. You can see the climate crisis as a complete, not just as a market failure, but as a failure of democracy and a failure of people to be able to have control over the economic system, which is obviously hardwired into the political and economic system that's dominated in this country and Western countries for the last 50 years. So one of the things that we've really pushed is climate assemblies. And they really show us an alternative future where the public are made custodians of nature and the future generations, and are given responsibility to navigate those complex questions collectively. So, look, there are things going on outside of the commons in the media, but I think the idea of the media commons is part of a growing ecosystem and pushback against 50 years of kind of economic centralization, the hollowing out of our democracy, and obviously the media as the so-called fourth. I've lost the word now, but what's the word? My brain. Yeah, you'll probably know this, but the not the fourth assembly, but the fourth pillar, what is a democracy. But basically, in effect, that essential part of our media has been hollowed out by this, and that's critically what we're seeing across so many areas of our life in everyday economy and everyday politics.
I actually think the fourth assembly, is a much better phrase than the fourth estate. It gives a much clearer idea of what, because I think there's something important there. I think making that connection between the idea of climate assemblies and media commons is really powerful, because you're like, well, of course, if you're going to have a big meeting of people to work out what they want to do about things, you're going to have to use media. Right now it's like, well, everything has to be some kind of hybrid event because 5% of people have COVID at any one time. So but also there's the kind of sense of the informational resources that you're trying to draw on and that you're going to have to use to, like you're saying, Shirish, to orient yourself in the world and therefore be able to talk to each other. It's not that there's media happening here and then the climate assembly there. You actually need like trusted media practices to be completely embedded in the thing that you're doing. So thanks a lot for that, Clive. I think we've got some great questions, and I will start bringing them in. But I wanted to start with a question, which I think threads through all of your contributions, but is also a kind of it's an open question because I think it is tricky, which is this question about devolution to kind of the community or neighbourhood level and the potential pitfalls of this. For example, in contexts where there may be people who look at our national broadcasters and are like, well, at least on the national broadcaster, I will see some Black people, even if in the area that I live, I'm the only Black person. So how do you deal with the problem that, different areas will have different demographics, and how do you, ensure that this isn't something that just replicates the same power structures? And Shirish, I'm sure you'll have some thoughts on that in terms of setting up a newsroom in Swansea, kind of aimed at people of colour. But I think that, that also fits with some of the things that you were saying, Lexie, about, to what extent is this a single code that applies to everything? To what extent is this a code of rules that can be different in different places? And I wonder if, Clive, you wanted to give any response to that about, the principles of subsidiarity and what that means. We had somebody respond, in fact, to Shirish's point, saying, doesn't journalism need to focus on telling factual truths rather than stories that resonate with you or your family, which I think is also part of this. It's, to what extent is this about a kind of big informational system, and to what extent is it about, what is literally happening materially for you right here, and where those things can sometimes conflict, as we've seen with COVID, where some people's experience of the pandemic has been so vastly different depending on where they're located. I don't know who wants to respond to that first.
I'll jump in very quickly. So the military have this kind of understanding of something called mission command, which is, they decide the kind of overarching objectives, the kind of those on the ground decide how it's done. And so I kind of feel that's a good starting point. I also think as well that if you're going to talk about, genuinely democratic, kind of close to the communities that you're serving kind of media, then some of the notions of what news is will be slightly different in different communities. And some of it is about trusting them to kind of make some of those decisions. It's not about telling them what's important, what isn't. But I think also as well, if it's genuinely democratic and it's genuine and there is genuinely kind of enough funding for it to be self-sustaining without kind of always worrying about whether there's going to be a program or so at the end of 5 years or 10 years or whatever, then I think you may find that news values begin to morph and change, and that what people want to hear from their news will not look anything like the BBC after 5 or 10 years. People may actually want more of a cultural component. They may, there may be more demand for international news. They want to know what's happening on the climate crisis on the other side of the world. I just think that, I think sometimes it's very hard to get our head around what a genuinely localized democratic news system would look like, because we always look at it through the lens of what our news is now. And I think it would probably surprise many of us if we could go into the future, this kind of, brilliant future that you've outlined, and look at it. We'd probably be quite surprised by what, different regions, how they were not consuming news, but actually, it was a two-way process. But anyway, I think it would be far more organic, and would probably be quite surprising how different it was if it wasn't constrained by the kind of constraints that current news is. And as we were explaining before, you think about the BBC and its priorities and the influences on it, as it's been already outlined by, I imagine, other speakers, or has been done in other books and other things, then you begin to realize the BBC could be a very different news broadcaster if it wasn't for those conflicts.
Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree with what Clive said, that actually, you know, in a sense, I don't mind if you live in a very white area, like I do, actually, apart from me. Then actually, I don't mind if there's an honesty about that. Funny enough, I was cycling back from the little village near where I live, and there's an agricultural college on the way, and I had like a recruitment thing for an open day. And the picture of the student on the banner was just like a white man. And I was like, I actually love the honesty of that, because every other kind of recruitment man is like, very multicultural, maybe married for there's lots of women, disabled people, black people. And it's like, well, that's just not honest. And actually, what I want is like that plurality, as Clive talks about. It's like, we're not saying that people in Usk, where I live, are just going to watch or engage with Usk news and nothing else. Actually, the more different stories we tell, the more stories are accessible. And what we get with the BBC and other news organisations is actually a really narrowing down of stories. To give an example, I did an investigation into the radicalisation of young people by the far right in Swansea about 5-6 years ago. And at that time, it seems like a kind of different world. The only discussion in that space was around radicalisation of Islamic radicalization, basically, of young people. And they could not accept that white people were being radicalized. So it was so difficult to get that on air. It did eventually get on the 6 and 10 o'clock news, but they just couldn't compute that that was happening because, you know, I call it the Ealing problem, that the vast majority of people who make television news live in Ealing. And so they are largely doing news by the people of Ealing for the people of Ealing. Unfortunately, they've got a national platform which isn't really reflecting the reality of the world beyond Ealing. So, yeah, I don't mind if there are kind of quite specific groups of people making specific types of journalism, news, information, actually, which is perhaps a more useful way of looking at it, as long as we have a plurality of that. So, and then people can choose, right? So, but I highly kind of endorse Clive's view on that. Of it, journalism, media looking very different if that happened.
Lexie, do you want to respond?
Yeah, and one feature I guess I would add to that layer of pluralism. Yeah, certainly. I think one feature I want to add to that layer of pluralism is this idea that you can still have a common baseline, a common sort of regulatory floor that we all adopt and we all agree to, while recognizing that objectivity, impartiality aren't real concepts in the way that we experience our lives. You know, a lot of us experience the world subjectively. So the idea that there's some ultimate arbiter of objective truth just doesn't match our realities. You know, we know that as part of just our general discourse. If you're around the dinner table or at the pub, you know, different subjectivities always overlap and intersect. And so one thing that we've developed within our code is this notion of partisanship. And what I think is perhaps one of the issues of more recent discourse is this idea of objectivity, empirical fact is something that can be tested and evaluated and we all agree on, when that's just not the case. And rather, by having a rule set, a framework which allows partisanship and subjectivity to coexist with known facts, with empirical facts, is actually the way forward, and through creating again, safe discursive spaces that reflect the multifaceted identities of those in that space. And I think that for me is the real issue with the kind of enduring legacy of sort of institutional media in the UK, is this notion that there's one objective truth that speaks to this homogenous audience of 67 million people, which just can't be the fact. And the idea of having a rule set that allows for both subjectivity and partisanship to exist alongside rules like anti-discrimination, non-invasion of privacy, non-intrusion, accuracy, transparency is a reality, because that's the practice we have in Press, and you know, we have a huge range of members that some of which, you know, regard themselves as news generalists, that just report on sort of local events, but others that report from a perspective or a certain ideology, whether that's a religious affiliation or ethnic or cultural affiliation, or whether that's through a political ideology, or even you know, a practice ideology. So we have a number of you know, again, specialist subject areas like that are interested in climate change or vegan lifestyle. So all of them coexist and agree to a benchmark rule set, without us as the regulator trying to say, well, one of those objective realities are true, and therefore this is factual and accurate or not. And so the idea that you know, whether or not there needs to be multiple codes, I think the way that we need to devise a rule set is by respecting different identities, different subjectivities, but within some baselines, and those baselines can be agreed to by the different populations, whether it's regionalized, localized, or nationalized. And every time we poll the public, they tell us the same things. It's like, I want my news to be accurate. I want my news to be reliable. I want it to be well sourced. But whether or not it resonates with my particular worldview is up to the individual. And that's what I would like to see in a media commons is diversity, but that is underpinned by some clear benchmarks that reflect the public's values about what news should be, what should the duties of media practitioners be.
Clive, are you wanting to come in?
Yeah, no, I find it fascinating, and that concept of objective reality. I guess it's. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to ask questions, but I guess the question I would ask is, looking through the media commons. Part of my question is, how would this exist or survive, kind of given, you know, that notion of capitalist realism? I think, you know, if you want to call that objective, you know, reality, it's seen through the lens of capitalist realism. If you think about the BBC, if you think about journalism, it's basically it self-regulates within the confines of what capitalism accepts as acceptable or not. We do self-regulate. Well, I think we do, and I think news does. And so I guess that question is, can the media commons ever exist side by side in the kind of political and economic system that we currently inhabit? I think if, let's just say, for example, in 2 years' time, we had a Labour government, and you know, Keir Starmer's government introduced this and put funding for it, it would be a fundamental challenge to the current kind of order of things, the reality, the kind of that capitalist realism, and it would. I mean, if you think the BBC gets attacked, then this would be kind of public enemy number one. So in a way, either this kind of, you know, helps bring down that, an end to that, or, you know, it would be chewed up. Does that make sense? I'm kind of what I'm saying is so radical and so contradictory to the current kind of polity and reality that we inhabit at the moment. It would it's clearly needed, but
Yeah, I mean, it's the manifesto, it should be said, really focuses on the thing that we want, but, you know, for it to work, it has to sit alongside a whole set of measures to deal with the things that we don't want, including, you know, all of the plurality measures that we've been talking about forever, all of the, you know, Murdoch is clearly not fit to run a company, and should just be stripped of his possessions, really.
And it helps you think about how something could look radically different. It helps you think outside of the confines of the current strictures, and what a kind of, you know, vibrant, you know, alternative media system could look like. And I think having that in your mind, being able to picture it. One of the things we know about climate policies is being able to paint them in bright, vivid colours about how this will change your life and that of your family and your community is really important to being able to sell these ideas to people, to get them behind them. And this is the same. And
I'm gonna read through some of the comments and questions that we have, and then try and direct a kind of winding up conversation. So we've had some comments saying, someone agreeing that they think that public funds will be essential to creating any meaningful diversity or plurality. But that, this would obviously need to be really carefully designed, because, the fact is that the government already does actually fund a huge amount of media outside of the BBC through indirect subsidies, through the VAT exemption. And that has absolutely no obligations attached to it whatsoever. So, in fact, news organisations can use it to pay off their hacking victims, and no citizen has ever been asked whether that is something that they want their tax money to be used for. We've got comments as well saying that law and regulation, whilst it should outlaw hate speech towards an outgroup, will never stop propaganda. The only solution is meaningful diversity. And I think that really echoes some of the things that you're saying as well, that if there's that having a variety of voices, which are themselves, like you're saying, all really situated in who they come from and who's made them, and not pretending that the view from Ealing is the view from everywhere, is a better route towards actually understanding the truth of what is happening. I've had that question. So there's a question saying, isn't one of the problems that not many people talk about media concentration, the problems of organisations like Reach, and how do we change this? And I think it is worth saying, you quoted the number, Clive, of 83% of local news titles are owned by 6 publishers. But as Shirish mentioned, NewsQuest are now buying up Archant, so that's going to be 5 publishers very soon. So you can literally see the concentration getting worse all the time. We've got more comments about, yes, people are kind and open, but there is a big, deep trust issue across key aspects of society and not just media, which, we always end up in these circular conversations about where do we start with these problems when they are so entrenched and the problems just keep coming from so many different angles. Did you want to come in?
Say something on the trust issue, Debs, because I think for me, actually, it's the existential problem facing any kind of journalism now or in the future. Because frankly, if people don't trust it, which they kind of don't right now, then actually there is no point us carrying on, because unless we can kind of, as you say, build, because we don't have it right now. And the thing I kind of always think about this, and this speaks to that commons, that participation, that collaboration. You build trust by doing trustworthy things. And there'll be plenty of journalists here who've been in meetings where people say, oh yeah, we need to build trust with our audience. Let's do that tomorrow. And that's not how relationships work, right? You have to show up day after day, week after week, year after year sometimes, and do trustworthy things. And sometimes those trustworthy things are doing things which don't have a benefit to you, which are showing up, listening, really hearing what people have to say and reflecting that, rather than just sitting in Canary Wharf or whatever and dispensing news. And so actually I think there's a really deep participatory listening part of this, which has to happen and we're finding it with the People's Newsroom projects, that the people we're working with can't think about doing journalism of their own until they've sort of done a bit of healing from the journalism that has been done to them, because they only see that as journalism. They don't see a future beyond that, because they only see journalism as something that's destructive to them. So I think before we can get to this point, there's quite a lot of healing work and listening work that has to be done by the industry. And like I say, that's why I say, if we don't do that, we will almost rightly make ourselves irrelevant, because we shouldn't be relevant if we don't respond to that need.
And I would add to that piece just that part of it is also, again, obviously, not just listening, but when you hear something that you don't like, we think you've got it wrong, we think that the way you did this wasn't correct and you need to account for that, that journalists respond in an accountable way. And I think that's part of the journalism challenge that hasn't been part of the conversation as well, is how willing journalists and media practitioners to cede some of that authority back to their readers and their audiences, for their audiences to decide what journalism, should be, for audiences to decide what the public interest is, not what journalists tell them to be interested in. And in consultation, the public and the industry working together on those terms of engagement, because at the moment, for most viewers, readers, listeners, experiences of journalism are people telling them what they need to know, rather than having those shared aims and those shared values by a community being reported on. So that's part of it, is how willing is the industry, willing to cede that authority back to publics as well, even if it means dispensing with their power, which is, relative to obviously the big news groups, the big broadcasters, but even that part of their practice.
Yeah, and I think that's, there's a question that I want to ask about the BBC, and I don't want us to then end up talking about that for another half hour, because we had a question as well from someone asking who should regulate the media commons? Is there an existing organisation? Is a new one needed? In the manifesto, we suggest that Ofcom is not fit for purpose for dealing with the broadcasting environment, and that a new regulator should be created. And we definitely look to Impress as a model of how that can be done in this more kind of consensual way. But maybe if I was to formulate a question around it, it's like, okay, in the dream world, could you give an example of, how a BBC that was part of like a functioning, vibrant media commons, how would it be different? What are some of the things, in my mind, I'm like, okay, we've got a different kind of regulation which has this much more kind of bottom-up feel to it, and maybe I imagine every library having like a portal where you can go and the librarian knows how to use it, and you can log your complaints, but you can also have a discussion with someone about whether this what the rules are and where they've come from, and whether this thing that you're worried about was a breach of the rules or not. That becomes this much more this collective process of trying to determine like what is harmful, and what does proper redress look like. So that's a kind of, in my mind, a way that and if the BBC was the kind of core of its regulation, was actually people in libraries having a chat, and sometimes also not just being able to respond with we didn't like that program and so you should apologize, but actually you portrayed my community in a really harmful way, and the redress is we now get to make our own program about ourselves, which actually portrays us in the way that we would like to be seen and that we think is more fair and more accurate. So I wonder if any of you've got any kind of visions of how a better BBC as part of a media commons could work. Am I putting you on the spot?
I'll leave Lexie to the regulation bit to Lexie, but on kind of what you've just said about the kind of redress thing. In an ideal world, we wouldn't need the redress, though, right? Because actually, these things communities wouldn't be portrayed wrongly in the first place. And there's a way to get to that, which is greater diversity. It's a different kind of journalism. So I think there's actually a big step we need to take. It's like, actually journalism would need to look really, really different. But actually, in an ideal world, you wouldn't just have, you would have Muslim journalists working there who, for example, who were reporting on the Muslim community, who were, or at least kind of a check to that. Right now, Clive will know this, there aren't the checks, right? We've been the people in the morning meeting saying, well, hang on, that's a bit racist, and people rolling their eyes at us, right? And like, I bring up,
you were where I did.
Yeah, but like, I worked in all those big news, but like, I've brought up stories about or from Wales when I lived in London because my backgrounds were, and you get the eye rolls right round the meeting room. These are organisations that are supposed to serve the whole of the UK, but there are no people from Wales, let alone people of colour or disabled people, or etc., etc., etc. So that has to change, because otherwise there are none of those cultural checks. Someone very close to me was in a meeting at one of these big national and international 24-hour news broadcasters recently, and they have a meeting about diversity and inclusion every month with senior management. And she brought up what she described quite rightly as an entry-level diversity chat about, all the planners being white, so therefore all the things which get to the daily news list being through a white lens. And they said, oh, we'll have to agree to disagree. It's exactly what Lexie is talking about. You don't get to disagree when someone is telling you something you don't understand. But that's the problem we're faced with right now. That there's an unwillingness to accept the reality of this. If you didn't have a problem, you wouldn't have to have a diversity and inclusion meeting every month.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if Lexie wants to come in on the regulation or to come in now, but I mean, one of the ways I kind of feel that you could begin to create accountability for some of the issues that we've been talking about in terms of what journalists look like, the communities that news represents, about not making the mistakes, the necessity for apologizing, again, is that kind of transparency and accountability. Maybe the BBC thinking of it more in a cooperative format. So as a co-op, so you have the license fee payers, the public, and the staff having a say over who the director general is, over who the senior management are, over the kind of the five, and having democratic accountability decisions on the 5-10 year plan for the BBC, where resources will go, where that money. So I just kind of feel when you have that kind of level of accountability and transparency to staff and the public, you may well begin to get a set of different priorities which better reflect the interests of those two groups, as opposed to what happens at the moment, which is that a bunch of executives basically represent the interests of those of their political masters, basically, and the economic forces behind that. So, I mean, there are ways of doing this, but I mean, when you were talking about, in an ideal world, where we currently are, some people don't have access to a library to hold a meeting. So, some people don't have, some people, don't have the time, don't have the, they're working, I was speaking to someone who's working 3 jobs at the moment, minimum, 0-hour contracts. How do they engage in kind of shaping the news agenda and shaping the services around them, including the media? So you can begin to see a kind of ecosystem of policies like universal basic income, universal basic services, 4-day week. You can begin to see how this would all begin to interact with a far more democratized media, because people wouldn't just become mere passive consumers. They would have the ability to actually engage. But under the current economic and political system, it's very hard to imagine this kind of ideal world. It's because it's literally impossible to enact as things currently are. So it's like it's a smorgasbord of different things that need to happen to enable some of the best bits of this this kind of people's manifesto, collective media manifesto to kind of come into being. But I think, finally, I will say, kind of politicizing this, I think one of the things that the last 5 years inside the Labour Party did was it's basically opened up the realm of what's possible. I mean, there were ideas out there before, but I do think there was an explosion of creative thinking around what's possible and what's not. And I think that may well be the legacy of the last 5 years inside my own party and politics. And I think, this is part of that ecosystem. So, but yeah, those just some reflections.
Lexie?
Yeah, I'll just finally add, in picking up on Shirish's point, a regulator is very happy when they don't have to do a lot of reactive regulatory work. So in this ideal system, you wouldn't have a very busy regulator on what I would call the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff tasks, hoovering up thousands and thousands of complaints every year, and then selecting off the most disproportionate ones and then only citing those sorts of decisions. Was when you look at the other models of regulation, it's very much the case. And I think it shows sort of endemic crisis of regulation if you have tens of thousands of complaints coming in every year, and only funneling through a few hundred or a handle of those, and rather the role of the regulator, I think, doesn't have to be so narrow to be a sort of industry complaints body or a complaints handling body. A regulator, in a radical vision, can have much more proactive roles. So, for example, we've initiated investigations where we've looked at issues of systemic abuse or cumulative abuse across titles, and that is trying to spot out problems before they manifest, and as I said, become cumulative and harmful in that way. But the regulator can do much more. So when you talk about this idea of the library as a civic space for people to come and understand their rights, the role of the regulator really is their first obligation is towards the public that they serve. And if you aren't engaging with the public, if you aren't giving them resources, guidance, access, services for free that help them participate in their space, in their sphere, then you're also not doing your role. And a big part of Impressa's strategy going forward is looking at that issue of public engagement, looking at what media literacy resources we can provide. And I'm not talking about literacy like, what is news? I'm talking about what are your rights? What are journalists' responsibilities? How do you engage with journalism, and what sort of redress can you have access to? So people come from a much deeper place of knowledge and understanding with engaging, not with media so that they can kind of spot fake news, but that so they can make really meaningful, decisions about how media is going to shape and influence their lives and how they're going to engage with it. And on the final point I'd like to make about the idea of the ideal, it's not theoretical. These practices are going on. I see it every day in my work. New types of models of publishing, new types of models of journalism working in cooperative with community. We're obviously doing a lot of experimentation with different types of regulation, but what we don't have is one of the earlier points I made was a kind of collective consciousness or a space where we can discuss this. It's happening in pockets. It's often happening in those regions or localities that are a bit better funded and have the resources to engage in sort of social experiments. But we don't have, this homogenous collective consciousness about what we want our media to be. So we can take those pilots, we can take those examples of practice and upscale them and uplift those best models and distribute them across the UK in all of its diverse communities. So that's my sort of final sentiment is it is happening. There are really good examples out there, but what we need is a much better public conversation to bring up that consciousness and create that demand from the public for what they want out of their media.
Yeah, and I definitely think that, the idea with the manifesto is to try and have this vision of what a whole system could look like. But it is clear that that lots of these things already exist. And that is actually the space that some kind of hope and some kind of inspiration can exist even in these times which are so far from the vision that we would like to create. And I certainly, I find Impress very inspiring. I find the People's Newsroom very inspiring. And I think that the way, Clive, that you are thinking across media and all of these other areas that you're looking at in terms of, you know, the privatization of other public institutions, in terms of how this, you know, fits with, you know, climate assemblies and, you know, social guarantee. And, you know, I think that is really, really important political work. So I'm really grateful to all of you for joining us today. Do any of you have any final burning points that you wanted to get in before we sign off? Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much to everyone for tuning in. Please do have a look at the rest of the Media Democracy Festival programme, which is on mediareform.org.uk. And we may see some of you in person at our live events on Saturday in London.